Welcome to Ring the Damn Bell. Man, tonight I have a very, very special guest, um, Travis Orndorff. He is the son of Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, WWE Hall of Fame, WCW, NWA, WWE talent, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. How are you, Travis?
Man, I'm pretty good. We talked just before the broadcast, and come to find out your first and last name is the same first and last name of my best friend. So
Yeah.
I think that set the mood for me to feel a little more comfortable, right?
That's awesome. I mean, like I said, Landry's in Louisiana. You'll be lucky not to run into 10 Landrys, every two people. But so I know everyone is obviously wanting they want to hear about your father, but and we're gonna get to your dad. But for the first half of this, I want to talk about you because you also have a very, very interesting story. You dealt with substance abuse and a lot of other issues. So let's start from the beginning. You're born. Your father is the great Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. How was your childhood?
So how do you answer that question unless you have a comparison?
Right.
Because it's all I know. Um, my brother's, just under 10 years older than me, and my mom and dad had him. I think they were 18 and 17. Like, my mom didn't finish high school because she was pregnant with my older brother. When my first memories, we lived in a few different apartment complexes before we settled down in Fayetteville. My dad bought the first and only ever house he owned. It was unique in this, that I think my father intentionally protected us from that world. Had we lived in a Connecticut, New York, New Jersey area, being that WWF was a New York territory, I think it would have been a little different. I grew up in a small town, and I went to a Montessori school, and those parents and those kids generally didn't care about wrestling. Now, when I went out and I was in like rec baseball, football, things like, I didn't play football then. I played in high school. It was those days where they put your name on the back of your jersey. So the rumors would, somebody would slip up and say, hey, Mr. Wonderful Son is on the other team, and like, it was hard to hide it when you have Orndorff on your back. As many Landrys as there are very few Orndorffs.
Right.
And so, for me, it was a normal childhood. Being able to look back and kind of understand what my parents had to do to just have some normalcy. It was, we kind of went to the same places over and over again because everybody got comfortable, whether it be, we went to church, we went to this small church. People were big fans of dad. Dad would be in town and come to service with us, and they would get autographs. But 6 months later, a year later, it wasn't, it was more like, oh, Paul's here, and maybe somebody brings their friend, and that comes up. But you know it was all I've ever known. And but when I've gotten the opportunity to sit down and talk with either my own therapist, other kids, you start to realize, yeah, it was unique. It was very unique. From a very young age, kayfabe was, it's just a word to people. Like, it really is. People throw it out there. Just like when people say, I'm in the business, I'm like, man, I've seen the business. Like, that, God bless you. I know you love it. I want you to appreciate and enjoy it. But there's just different levels of access. And what I mean by access is, it wasn't uncommon for me to see drugs around my house at a young age. Very, very desensitized to things. Not my dad, but my older brother. And my brother got in a lot of trouble. And so he was in jail by the time I was 6 or 7. By the time I was 9, he spent time in prison. And, I recognize the fact that he and I didn't have the same parents.
Right.
10 years apart. They were different human beings when I was born. They made all the mistakes with him. And so, my parents adopted or, took custody of 3 of his children. So they were raised like my sisters. There was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of anger. There was drug addiction. There was my own substance use. I remember, I was 19, 20 years old, and it was I felt very lonely all the time. And part of that was everywhere you go during that period, you were identified as somebody else's child, not, or, somebody's child, not as who you are. And so with kayfabe, we pretended like everything was okay. You weren't allowed to bring out the demons and skeletons that, we go to church and everybody's like, oh, your mother's so sweet. And I'm like, she was just dropping F-bombs on the way here. Like, this is, my brother would get in trouble and they would say, where's your brother? And the line we would say is, oh, he works for the state. And so kayfabe was so ingrained in us that you lose sense of reality. You really do. And you become a liar and exaggerative and dramatic, and you start to mirror wrestling. And then I got older, and it was at one point I was like, remember, and somebody said Orndorff, and I was like, yeah, he's my father. And they were like, oh, I just didn't know how to pronounce it. Who's your dad? And so there was this evolution, because the season of my life when he was on TV had ended, right? He retired. He was done. And I didn't know how to turn that part of my brain off. And I had to rewire it. But the substances, really alcohol, my early 20s specifically, it was experiencing those allowed my brain to just slow down. And, I could feel comfortable in my own skin. I could act out with comfort, like I was kind of a wild person. And there were some Cancun trips, right? And so I know for a fact some people remember me to this day, unfortunately. So there was a lot of this idea. In fact, I'll finish with this. I had opportunities when I was younger to pursue acting and things like that. My dad was adamant he didn't want me to have anything to do with it, and his guidance was, you can do it after 18. I'll give you an opportunity. And so Dad was very attuned to the life. And at 19, I went out to LA for a short period of time, and I had some meetings that were set up through the contacts we had. And within like a week and a half of just complete debauchery, I called my dad up and I was like, I have to come home. I'm going to die. Like, I can't stop. And so, you learn how to deal with life where everybody else is comfortable, but the reality is you are completely uncomfortable in your own skin, and your sense of identity gets lost.
Yeah, and you bring up the word kayfabe, and it's a word that I use a lot with this podcast. And the reason why I use it is, well, I want to be part of the community. I'm just doing this wrestling podcast, and so I should use the word kayfabe. And it dawned on me as you were telling me this, that just that one word kayfabe, that means nothing to us except to explain, what's reality or what's not, is something that we just kind of take for granted. When in reality, the word kayfabe can actually have repercussions for families of professional wrestlers, because it's like they're living this almost a lie. I mean, when your dad came home from the road, and I know you was just a child, but do you remember him having a hard time going from kayfabe to reality? And if so, how did that affect you as a child?
So I think the thing that I would kind of direct you in a different direction on is, you assumed that those were separate things. Kayfabe was reality. It's just a matter of who was in front of you. And so for me, growing up kayfabe, because I was 6 years old during the first WrestleMania, and then I was 21 years old, 22 years old, when my dad had his last match, with WCW. And so during the younger years, we would go places, and most people were very respectful. As with anything, you have some extremely passionate fans that their excitement really, really, it motivates them to make decisions they probably wouldn't normally do with just the excitement. And so it wasn't uncommon for me to be somewhere with my dad and somebody asked me questions about my life. And I mean, very young. And so I'd be on the road with my dad at 5, 6 years old, going on trips for a week at a time, because that would be when I could spend time with him. And he would say, kayfabe. And that meant shut up, don't answer that, and get over here. Right. Like, so my father was, I think what I would say is my father being Mr. Wonderful wasn't a character at all. That was really the removal of a filter. He was very intense. He had, he could act out in anger if he wanted to. He could say really harsh, angry, mean things, and the next second not mean it, right? Like it was, he had a rough childhood himself. He grew up in a trailer park. He had his loving sister and brother, and he had a family. He loved his dad, he loved his mom, but that was strained. And so when he would come home, this is what it looked like. It would be, sorry, he would fly in on a Thursday. He would come get me out of bed, at some point, and then I would sleep in there, by the way, bad arm or good arm, those arms were rock solid and very painful to sleep on. But the next morning it would be, hey, have you finished your schoolwork? Do you have any tests? Do you have A's? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Okay. You want to stay out of school with me? So I would spend the entire day with him, go to the gym with him. And so when you approached him in normal life, he was grateful that you were a fan, but he was also aware he didn't know what you were going to do. And so, because you'd be surprised what people would try with him. And so when I was with him, he was just my daddy. And when we were on the road, even when he went out there to wrestle, he was still my daddy. I didn't see some kind of different reality, but we would be places or be in the road and something he didn't like would happen. And that kind of that identity, that Mr. Wonderful that I think he really was able to channel, that would come out. The anger would come out, the frustration, the intensity. Now, I had such a close relationship with him. And my mom used to say, like, he treats you different. And I would start laughing when he would act that way. And then he would look at me and you could see he was still kind of ticked, but it would click. Oh, I probably need to chill out. And then he would start laughing. So I never thought that he was two different people. Mr. Wonderful was just, maybe when he did the skits, like some of that was method acting. He hated cigarettes. He did, this is the 80s. So like less than 14% of the country was overweight. So when he saw somebody overweight back then, it was a funny thing because he would be mad, but it wasn't anger towards them. It was this weird empathy that he wanted to fix it. And he had a solution and he wanted you to take care of yourself and you would feel better. And that was the part that I would get to understand. But if you were around him and just heard that part, you wouldn't know what was behind it. And I think most people that have met my dad, and probably 95% of the stories I get where I approached your dad and he sat with me for 30 minutes and gave me life lessons. And I'm like, yeah, that's what he did with me. I didn't know he was out there doing it. So this journey of my dad coming, passing, and then us taking on these social media sites and me trying to share the version I knew, the father that, his title was Mr. Wonderful, but it wasn't a separate identity. It was just the filter came off, right? And so I think more than anything, when I talk to fans, all of them have these stories of this decent, genuinely humble, grateful human being that you did not want to upset. right? Like his strength and his anger, they were legit. And a lot of, in fact, real quick, Brian Blair, my dad's best friend, and he didn't have a lot of friends, so that means something in my world. He used to call my dad. He would call, and I would answer the phone, and hey, is Oscar around? And so my dad called him Beeper. I've yet to get that story, but he called my dad, and a lot of the other wrestlers called him Oscar because of Oscar the Grouch on Sesame Street, and so. He was temperamental. Now, what I'll finish with here is my father became a born again Christian. I think it was after WrestleMania. So I think I was 7 years old, and I only know what I remember. And I always thought my father loved me unconditionally. I felt that way my entire life, and I feel that way today. But as I understand it, once he found his faith in Jesus Christ, he changed. In fact, he quit, wrestling shortly thereafter. He opened up a bowling center. We weren't allowed. He didn't sell alcohol. He was adamant we wouldn't sell alcohol because he had seen, alcoholism in his family. So I was in there at a very unique time, and when he was making some drastic and lifelong changes.
Yeah. So with your substance abuse, which you said was alcohol, do you think that your older brother dealing with that kind of led you into that direction, or what was it that pushed you there? Do you guys have a family history of substance abuse?
So one I will say is nobody pushed me to do anything. Yeah, I didn't need anybody's assistance at all. So I'll say my version of it was I dabbled a little bit like at 15, didn't touch it for several years. My house was chaos. Those end years, my mom was chaos, and so we always had a strained relationship. I did not know about her abuse till much later, and that was something that back then, I'll be honest with you, like it wasn't. Nobody ended up on the streets, with a needle in their arm. So look, if you can manage it, but I remember my dad approaching me one time, and this was my early 20s, and I was bartending in downtown Atlanta. So, there was multiple substances available at the time. And he came in, my brother had been out for a period. He always would get out and he'd go back. Right. But he went to my dad and said, "Hey, Travis is doing this." So my dad, the rule with him was don't lie about it. So I was in the kitchen. Dad walked in and he goes, "Hey, you doing this?" "Yes, sir." "Are you hooked?" "No, sir." "Good. They're not what they used to be." And he walked out of the room. And that was enough for me. That's, when I wasn't embarrassed. I was like, oh, maybe I need to have a deeper conversation about that. Now, through my 20s, I was very much functional. I was very successful. I had a family, but I really struggled with it every day. I struggled with alcohol every day. I thought I was successful when I just drank at home. Like if I could, that to me was like, well, I'm home. What's the problem? Right. So those things caught up with me because the reality was I was self-medicating. One, I have dealt with chronic pain since I was 9 years old. And so I was icing my knees in high school after a game. Life was physically hard on me, and it had been for years. There was periods of time during that they had put me on opiates at different points. And so now that I know the neurological effects, I'm like, oh, well, I was going through withdrawals and had no clue, right? And I don't know that they did either. So move forward through my 20s. It was very much a struggle. Early 30s, things are starting to click. I'm doing well. I have a career in finance. And then in 2013, in August of 2013, I threw a softball from, left field. And when I did, my arm collapsed. And so the bicep came off, the tricep twisted over, and the bone fragments went through my nerve, and it left my arm paralyzed for a period of time. And I lost the use of my hand. So at that point, 50 staples, elbow to chest, reattached everything, still arm not working completely, hand not working. And they prescribed me 12 Percocet, 10 milligram and 12 150 milligram tramadol, and just under 30 gabapentin a day, which is about 9,000 milligrams. Those are all 3 times the legal amount you would get today. And so I used those. It got me through. I functioned. And then I started weaning myself off. And when I did, and I had not been drinking anything, when I started weaning myself off, I started having severe mental health issues, severe panic attacks. And I genuinely had no idea what was happening to me, because it never in my mind was crossed. Like, if I can just quit, then I'm doing well. And so come to find out about post-acute withdrawals. So during that period of time when I would come off them, oh, and by the way, I had surgery every year. So I would go on them and off them, on them and off them. I genuinely lost my mind. And I remember sitting with a doctor and saying, I had been diagnosed with ADHD before it was called that. Back then, they just called it annoying. But, I remember sitting with the doctor, and I was telling the doctor my symptoms, and they were like, well, you're bipolar. And I'm like, but I wasn't last year. So what has changed? No doctor, no matter what I told him, connected the dots. And so it was the longest 10 years of my life was from the age of 34 to 44. Because even though in my early 40s, like around 39, 40, I started to get help. I genuinely was like, okay, well, what do I do? And then sitting with doctors, they're going, hey, that this is the fact that you didn't end up going and just finding opiates is still kind of mind boggling. And so from there, I went to treatment, right? And I had to deal with these resentments and anger that I had. I had to recognize my own behavior and how I treated people. Because I think, like my dad, I had a dark side, but I also had a side where, I wanted to do the right thing. And so from there, going through treatment, having, long-term sobriety and working towards that, and long-term recovery, there were times doctors prescribed me something that was a struggle to come off of, but I knew how to handle it at that point. So nobody pushed me into it, but it was a way of dealing with self-medicating physical pain and all this damage and all these things that happened in my real life that we weren't allowed to talk about. And it took me time to even remember some of those things and not only deal with it in a way where it was professional or through a professional and like in a healthy manner, but also, doing the work, going to meetings. I became a Christian when I was 18. I didn't know how to do it, but I did it. Right. And so, things went south from there until, God intervened in my life, and he intervened with a few people. And then after my dad died, I spiraled again for a second, not so much with substances, but just emotionally. Mm. And so, I will say this: people, as I know it, do not like grief. And my belief is grief is just a living proof that you loved something so much that it hurts. Mm-hmm. And my dad dying, that was really the first time I'd ever lost myself. Now, I didn't know who I was, but at that point, I had no idea who I could even be. And I'm grateful because I loved him so much that his unconditional love to that point was genuinely like my lighthouse. It was like, if I'm capable of loving him this much, there must be some good in me. And I needed to know that because I didn't always believe that.
Yeah. One reason I was looking forward to this conversation is because our story with our fathers are so similar. My dad was everything, and I lost him. And when I lost him, I went through this period where I felt like my father was actually my conscience. So without my conscience, what am I supposed to do? What's going to stop me from crossing those lines? And I was a screw up for a few years before, thankfully, I was able to come back to where I should be at. But during that period where, because you mentioned about, your father's unconditional love. I was a wild kid as well, and my dad loved me no matter what. During that period when you started dabbling with alcohol, when you said your dad walked in and said, it's not like it used to be, was there ever a point that there was a wedge between you and your father?
No, not at all. And so, for better or for worse, you started out and you never think you're going to end up like the guy that you're hanging out with, right? And so, it was one of those thoughts, well, I'll quit when this happens, and I'll quit when this happens. And then all of a sudden you're like, I can't find a day on the calendar that I went 24 hours without having a drink, right? And still at the same time, extremely successful at work. And I thought, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, right? And so that never, the wedge was never there. The concern was there. And then I got good at hiding it. I didn't, if you're around me, you probably didn't know the difference. I had anger issues. I had, I was not a good husband. I wasn't as good a father as I was capable of being, but I loved my wife and I loved my kids. I was bad at it a lot of times, but I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do by going to work, because that's, kind of how I grew up. Dad wasn't around either. And so there was no wedge. The only time there was ever a wedge in our relationship, and it really wasn't one that was real. He money was tight through periods of my life. My mom, money would just disappear with her, as would memorabilia, right? And so he would need something. And I remember one time I had gone to him and I was getting a loan for something. I can't remember what it was, but it was like $5,000. And I said, can I put this in a CD, right? In fact, I forgot about this. Just somebody remind you. So can I put this in a CD for a year and I'm going to pay this back? I'm like, I can't give it to you for a year. And he's like, of course, right? Well, 6 months later, he's like, hey, I need that money. I'm like, Dad, we talked about this. And back then the penalty, they weren't regulated like they are, or if you can even do that anymore. But, he would get angry then. And then he would get angry in that moment. It might last a day. Wasn't anything violent or cussing. It was just like, you said, and I'm like, Dad. And I knew he would get over it, right? So the only time we ever had a wedge was always around money. Now, that was the first one, and there was no wedge. Like the next day, he's like, I came to understand, like, my mother was creating these kind of scenarios where he would get frustrated. So, there'd be times, hey, can you cash a check? And I'm on like the other side of the country, for work. And I'm like, I literally can't. Like, that's, and you're asking me to stop everything. I got kids going to violin and guitar and everything else, right? And so, he would get frustrated. We only didn't talk one time. And that was, it was over something simple. And he needed the money right then. And I was like, no, I'm not leaving this to go do that. I will do it on this day. And he kind of got mad. And then he called me back later and he asked again. And I'm like, I just told you. And then he got madder. Right. So that there was a few weeks there where we didn't talk that. And even then when we did, he didn't remember it. You got to remember this. We had the autopsy done by Dr. Amalu and his team. And when they did the autopsy, a friend of mine from high school worked at the funeral home, and he called me. He said, man, I know you told me to tell you this. Are you sure you want to hear it? And I was like, yeah. He said, the guy that did the autopsy said he's never seen a brain that shriveled up like this. And he said he hasn't known who anybody was, including himself, for the last 20 years. And I said, that's impossible. I talked to him almost every day, for over 15 years when I was, out and about, working and whatnot. We'd talk on my way to work or whatever, right? And then I went back and I looked at his journals after he passed. And the only reason I could date it, because he was a doodler, I found phone numbers that I had in like early 2000. So this is 2021. So we're talking 1999 to 2003, 2004. He would have my name. And one of them, I was like, that number's from like 2001. And it had my name and it said son. And then next to it had it said question marks, or it had question marks. And I'm like, he was questioning who I was. And then when I really look back, he guided the conversation through questions. So I think he knew who I was, but maybe didn't always know what was going on. But, it would come in and out until, the last few years of his life where it was like, oh, this is bad.
Well, and we skipped over a whole bunch of questions I'm going to get to.
We talked too much. I'm sorry.
No, you're good, my man. I like things to be organic. I just write stuff down just so I can remember. I have a bad memory. But with your father's death, and you just brought the doctor the autopsy about his brain being so shriveled up, do you believe that, although I don't think trauma, from my research I've done, could cause Alzheimer's, I do believe, though, it could make it progressively worse faster than it would have been. I know your dad suffered a lot of concussions. I mean, he was a professional wrestler, for the love of God. Do you think that all of these concussions may have made his Alzheimer's ravish his brain even faster than it would have?
So first of all, we have no family history of Alzheimer's at all. We have no family history of dementia at all. None of my family, none of my grandparents, none of them have that in their history, right? I know you said, you were saying, you talked about your dad, you kind of had the same relationship as I did with my dad. And my first thought was, he gave you B12 shots and protein shakes at 8 years old. That's just, that's what I was thinking of. Because I remember like
emotional relationship. We had the same emotional relationship.
I was like, no, but that's just where, like, I think I did a joke when you were saying you were married, you were officiating the marriage of your nephew.
Yes.
But you said, I'm marrying my nephew. Yeah. And my first thought was, well, Louisiana, like, that's not a shock. I'm like, the Bible Belt, but some of these people only live in Genesis, and all those people were marrying sisters and everything. I forgot what we were talking about.
We were talking about, the concussions.
Oh yeah,
possibly,
So no history of either of those in our family. And what I'll share is, I spend a lot of time on these things because I've either experienced them and I help other people deal with them. It's kind of where my life purpose and work has gone over the last few years. And so you can look at the National Institute of Health and of Medicine. You can look at different countries and the way they handle dementia and Alzheimer's. And so he was having memory problems when he was in his 40s. Like, it wasn't new. What I do believe expedited all of this was when he had chemo and radiation for his throat, because that, you're getting chemo and radiation all near your brain. So I don't believe he had Alzheimer's or dementia. Now, as I understand it, those are percentages of your brain that matter that start to negatively or start to decline. Mm-hmm. I think it might have looked like Alzheimer's, but it came directly from those concussions. Right. If there's no genetic marker that gives us that inclination, right? He was as healthy, like, man, I'm not joking. And I say it every day. I did not like food growing up. It did not taste good. There was no fat. There was no salt. I remember like going somewhere and eating some food. And I'm like, what is this? And they were like, it's medium rare steak. I'm like, this is delicious. I hate steak because we always had it well done. And it's like chewing leather. And looking back, I think about all the horrible things my dad did to these cows at medium well. It breaks my heart. But when you look at
real quick, Travis, I laugh about that because I used to eat my steaks well done and with ketchup. And I like to do research before someone comes on for the interview. And so I watched a couple of podcasts that you're on. And when you mentioned in another podcast about the steaks well done, and you guys weren't allowed seasoning, just hot sauce and ketchup, I looked at my wife and I'm like, see, Paul Orndorff, that's my kind of man then, because of the fact that's how I used to eat it. And it's my daughter who always would give me crap because that's how I ate my steak. She likes hers medium well, that I'm like, okay, I'll start, I will do my best. And you're right. It's I wish I would eat my steak medium well this whole time instead of well done, because I have wasted so much money on well done steak.
There's so many rumors that get out there about different things. Where, look, eat your steak how you want, right?
Right.
Like, I don't care. Like, it's not like I am not offended by. Listen, I grew up with a dad named Mr. Wonderful.
Right.
You get tough skin and thick skin very, very. And if and I was getting ribbed by wrestlers, they didn't care how old I was. It was the same ribs. They were basically in those rooms. We were the same age, and not that I went up to 40. They came down to 8. Let's be honest here. Like, they were childish. Right. But when I remember asking my dad one time, as I started to see the memory, he probably was in his mid to late 50s. And, over time, people want to believe, and I get it. Like, they ask questions like, did your dad talk about this match? And I'm like, no. And I would not have cared at all. Like, that would have been, and I would have left the room, right? What I wanted to know was the experience. Like, what was it like dealing with Vince? Why did you leave WWF? I met all the other wrestlers, so it's like, why would I care about Hulk Hogan? I've seen, like, if you watch anything, like, people are like, what was it like? I'm like, they were naked. They were sweaty. It was disgusting. Completely nasty. You saw them in a ring like I saw them in their underwear, and that was ugly, right? So, and just to be honest, like, there was a few guys that were built, but most of them were hairy and sweaty and gross. Like, my dad was ripped, Tony Atlas, but like, you don't want to see people's, personal side, if you will. Mm-hmm. I don't want to know what they're wrestling with. But that's what I was in the dressing room. There was nothing glamorous. There was no lights. It was cards and profanity. So, when I asked Dad about some matches. I said, how many times did you wrestle unconscious? Because I've had multiple concussions and I have a bad right arm. And I'm like, how did I bring this on myself without a career in wrestling, right? But he was like, Travis, there's so many matches that I don't even remember finishing. And he's like, or I don't remember getting to the end, but somehow we got through it. Hit my head on the steel chairs, or, Dad did not have 1 through 5 gears. It went straight from neutral to 5. And so I use it as this example. Like, I have found that when I do things, I have this kind of intensity too, not comparing, but it is a personality thing, I think, where I'll grab a plate and I'm like, why am I gripping this so tight? Right. And it's just kind of how I operate. It's how my oldest operates, and it's how my dad operated. He didn't know how to bring it back and then still feel like he gave it his all.
Right.
And his pride, the pride of his life, will always be not who he wrestled, the fame, the Hall of Fames. It was that when he went out into that ring, you got all of him. There was no breaks. There was no day off. There was no, I'm mailing this in. He would go at it. And it was Bill Watts who was about to fire him. He was a mid-card, about to let him go. And he said, Paul, if you don't do something, like, this is your last match. And, from there came the Brandon Bull. And I still believe that, if you look back at the matches, and I've had the opportunity to get clips, there was a period where as a heel, he was getting he was getting praise. People loved it. They wanted the pile driver. And there was, I don't know if this is the case, but from what I can find, Roddy Piper, I did see that when, after Piper's Pit, after 85, when you got to the later 80s, they started to cheer Piper, even though he was, a heel. But my dad, you can find it in like 1985, 1986. So there was a match. Bobby Heenan was telling me about it, the Hall of Fame. He said, Travis, like they had to pull your dad off of Hogan because it got to a point where there was a lot of people clapping for your dad. Like it wasn't supposed to be 50-50, and it started to turn the other way. And,
Right.
I people ask me all the time why your dad wasn't in WrestleMania 3. That's why I think it was to try to cool down some of the momentum that he had that would have negatively affected Vince's idea of what the brand should be.
Yeah, and I as we talked about before we've been on air, I grew up in Louisiana. I grew up watching Mid-South Wrestling, so that's how I was introduced as a young child to your father, was Mid-South Wrestling. And I never forget that when I found out, he disappeared off of Mid-South, and I found out that he was wrestling for WWF at the time. I was legitimately angry with your father, because there was such a different style of wrestling. I didn't like WWF. I didn't like the cartoonish characters. I didn't like Hulk Hogan. I was used to the style of wrestling that I liked there. But it's funny because in hindsight, people give Hogan all the praise about the success of WrestleMania. Well, your dad also deserves the praise for the success of the WrestleMania as well. So, and that led to professional wrestling changing, and it continues to change. But WrestleMania is absolutely why we have what we have today. So if your father would have never left and went to WWF, there's a good possibility that WrestleMania may have been a failure. But as far as happiness, was your dad happier with the territories, or was he happier with this big monster WWF, especially after WrestleMania?
So that's a very difficult question to ask, because I genuinely don't think my dad was ever really happy. Like he was in his retirement, like when he had grandkids running around, stuff like that. Like he was always in a good mood, but like that, it was he loved what he did, but he hated not being home.
Right.
And so that would have skewed his version of what he liked better. He never, ever spoke negatively about the territories. He very much talked about where, we did a recent one with Ernie Ladd and how he, really helped my dad's career, and him and JYD at Mid-South. And there were these, I think, the thing that you really can look at more so is that was how you earned your stripes.
Right.
And so going back to WrestleMania, the frustration that everybody gets very animated about this is as if it was more difficult, but that was their problem with Mr. T and Liberace, because that's not what they had to. They went through hell to get to this point. I get what you're saying, because I've seen those matches. They're not glamorous at all, right? There's no showmanship to it, and going back, wrestling was a part of a circus, right? And so it was always showmanship.
Right.
In fact, there was a ton of showmanship. Then it got really real, and then it became showmanship again, right? And so my dad had experiences along the way that he valued, but he loved the paychecks of WWF. Let's just be honest. Right. So he hated the travel. I know he was injured. And in 1988, they looked at the surgery, and he was like, "I'm not doing that," because surgery looked different back then. But I don't think he preferred one over the other. I think it was all kind of a journey. And I know he enjoyed WCW.
Power plant.
Well, and I grew up just south of the airport in Fayetteville, and so we were. That was when during my, those years, really my high school years, I got to go with him a lot because it might be, he's like, hey, you want to go to Augusta and skip school tomorrow? I'm like, of course I do, And so we would go. I remember being there for Cactus Jack. I went to Australia for a month when I was 13 and, they were doing doing a tour there. So my belief, the happiest he ever was that I ever saw him was when he was running the power plant. And I don't think I've ever told anybody this, but Dad, when he went to college, and keep in mind, my dad has never talked about any class he ever took, right? So I don't know how he got a 3.5 years away from a degree. In fact, when he graduated, the principal of the school handed his diploma to my mom and said, you earned this. But, shoot, I forgot where I was going with that. That just tells you my old age.
So you were saying that, he was happiest when he was at the power plant. That's the thing. And he went to college.
So he went to college. He was, his plan was to be a PE teacher. That was what he was graduating in. Yeah. That's right. That was the thing I forgot. I forgot it because I always forget it in the first place. So yeah, his plan was to be he was like a semester away when he quit. So when I hear, and I can piece, like I'm kind of flying over all these years, all these interactions. I've heard Arn Anderson say it. I've heard Steve Austin say it. I've heard these guys go, Paul gave me the best advice, right? And the best career advice. Arn articulates it very well. Take care of your body, be great at your craft. They'll never be able to deny you. And Steve Austin, and I think I was in the car when this conversation happened because I remember going, Dad, what do you mean? And he said, Steve, there is life after wrestling. And that was, this kind of framing it out. So in my opinion, and how I grew up, and then how I've seen other people grow up, or, how he was around them as they were growing up, I believe deep down my father was a teacher. And so being in the power plant and giving to them, now he held them to a great standard, but I think that was when he was the happiest. He loved Chuck. He loved Sean. Like those guys, not all of them, but several would come over to the house. And Rick Rude came over and go hunting. Rick Steiner came over. Steve came over. Austin came over. But the guys at the power plant were over more than anybody ever was. In my entire life, they would come over, work on my dad's Land Cruiser, whatever it was. There was just a special bond he had with those young men. And I think he adored that role. It allowed him to be home, and it allowed him to also wrestle and work out all day long, right? So that I think was the happiest he ever was.
So you mentioned the Junkyard Dog. Do you remember him ever talking about why he didn't want to drop, I think it was a North American title, to JYD?
No, I don't. That's the first I've ever even heard of it, to be honest with you. I can tell you we spent some time, I was really young, but, when I would go into the when my dad would go wrestle, JYD would look after me because that was, we toured together. It was kind of the same group. And, and he was, from my knowledge and my experience, he was always very fond of him. He hated being goosed, so they would sneak me over to goose him all the time. And, those kind of jokes. So I always thought there was a good relationship there. Here's what I would say about that. These guys, and it's funny because fans are very, very, they get really excited about this person's a champion. And, then there's somebody looking at going, oh, it's a fake belt, right? Like, why would you, somebody handed it to you? It's part of the script. That is no different than if you're with your employer and they promote you and you get excited about a new title.
Right.
And then, sometimes after you've achieved so much, they have to move on and they have to give that president title to somebody else. Right. So I think there was a level of ego. There always was.
Right.
But even with those belts, I think my dad once said to me, I said, Dad, why don't you ever get the Intercontinental? And he's like, because that's not the belt. So, and I remember when he had the TV title, I was like, hey, I remember sitting around the house like in a bag, and I'm like, Dad, do you like having the title? He's like, no, it's a pain in the butt to carry around. Like you know what I'm saying? So I think for him, he knew what got him paid. He wanted that recognition. So I think the World Championship belt meant something to him because of what it meant for his income, what it meant for his career. That was ingrained in those guys. So these little back and forth, keep in mind these guys were still testosterone filled in the gym, partying, whatever. And they just would, and they were in their 20s. There was a few guys that were really, really, really intelligent. And a lot of them were like, but these guys weren't scholars. They're, you got your exceptions. I don't mean that in a mean way, but they knew what the title meant, and it has nothing to do with the title. It has to do with the income, the stability.
Right.
And they went week to week, not knowing if they were going to wrestle the next week sometimes. Promoters were horrible. From what I hear, they're sometimes bad today. But I remember we were in Australia, there was a promoter, and he cut some money out of my dad's paycheck. And my dad confronted him. And when I say confronted him, I mean in an elevator, closed the door, and had to come into Jesus. And the guy ended up paying him what he said he was going to pay him, right? But like, it wasn't uncommon for these guys to basically be, well, I'll see if we're going to have you on next week. And then that Thursday or Friday rolls around, and they're gearing up, right?
Right. So I want to put to rest, if we can, a rumor that has always been there. It's about your father's arm. The rumor has always been that it was Hogan that hurt your father's arm. What is the real story behind the injury?
So I'd never heard Hogan. That's the first I've ever heard that one. I did not know that was, and I stay out of that stuff, just so you know. Right. I'm not going to be dishonest. There's times some things got said on some of these social media sites that I think are disrespectful, and you're crossing a line. And there's no reason to speak to me that way or anybody that way. Very rarely do I go, hey, not okay. I'll generally just delete and block because I don't want to engage with. You're not going to have an educated conversation, and I don't get offended. It's more of no, that's not acceptable. I don't want anybody reading this on our page and seeing the negativity, right? Because I respond to it too. So when it's not there, then when I see it and I know I'm just going to let it go, it makes life very, very, what happened? It made life very, very easy.
Okay.
Let me finish the story. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
So to my knowledge, based on my conversation with my dad, it was not Hulk Hogan. That's not true. Not to my knowledge. And I do know who it was, but here's what I would say to that. Dad knew his body better than anybody I've ever met. And I've met some very, very healthy people, right? Like bodybuilders. And I've talked to them, and they've kind of, shared that kind of same sentiment, right? Dad had an idea and said, this is when this happened. And I remember thinking in my mind, how could you know for sure? Because it could have deteriorated, or there could have been something. But when I had, a 58 pull stub, chest to elbow. And, I believe the day before I felt a snap. And then the next day I throw a softball and my arm collapsed. So yes, I think I know what happened,
right?
But there's always kind of that. So what I'd say, it wasn't Hulk Hogan, and it did. He believed it did. He got kicked in the chin, is what it was. But I still think a lot of that is speculation, and it would be unfair to put that on another human being that can't defend themselves to my father. And the reality is, there was a lot of wrestling that happened. That could have been, that could have been the point when it finally went.
Right.
But no, it was not. It was not Hulk Hogan.
Okay. So has your dad ever talked about what his favorite match was, or his favorite storyline that he was involved with?
No, he wasn't very sentimental about those things. What I'll say is um, the Toronto match with Hogan and WrestleMania, those, in talking to him, I remember saying, Dad, when was it, or when did it happen that when you walked out, you can't replace that feeling, is kind of what I said. And he's like, man, he's like, that's the best feeling in the world. He's like, there's no drug to compare it to. And I was like, was it better than having a kid? And he said, oh yeah. And I'm like, yeah. And so I'm like, God almighty, but he very much appreciated and loved certain wrestlers.
Mhm.
So the Toronto thing, like, you're going out to 70,000 people either booing, like, he was doing his job
Right.
at the highest level. There are people that still hate him today
Mhm.
because of things that happen. And I'm like, people watch those videos of him in the gym and they're so angry. And I'm like, he is still getting heat, 40 years later. And so the people that he always talked about, that he loved wrestling, and just said they went to war on multiple occasions. One was Tito Santana and the other was Brian Blair. And, those two were the ones he said over and over again that he was like, man, we had some good matches, and he would go into, examples. And though he loved wrestling, the two of them loved it, loved it, loved it.
So, did your father ever tell you how he got into professional wrestling, or why
Oh
he
yeah.
got into professional wrestling? What was that story?
Okay. You're a little comfortable. My butt's starting to hurt. So, he, and I've mentioned this story recently. I don't know why I never told it before. It didn't come up. But so he had gotten drafted by the Saints and was there. And back then, one, he hated being away from home. He wanted to be, he wanted to be in Tampa, wanted to be in his comfort zone. And the second is they hazed him, and he did not like being embarrassed ever. Not that never went away. And so, at the lunchtime, the guys on the team would make him sing. And I think at one point they were trying to get him on a desk with a dress on. And but they made him sing I'm a Little Teapot. And I think he did it once and went, this isn't for me, and left. And so, he tried to sing in football. He was pretty much tired of it, I think. And he went to my grandfather, my mom's dad. My grandfather, one of the most intelligent men I've ever met, but also a phenomenal communicator. I don't think that man's ever walked into a room where he didn't end up knowing everybody. And so, in fact, my girlfriend hates that I'm like that. Just she's like, you can walk around like you're a celebrity, and I'm like, oh, I am. She's like, you can say this stuff as long as you don't laugh. You got to act serious, and I'm like, because of course I'm joking, right? But it was a Saturday morning. Mom and dad, dad was a young father. My grandfather got him a job at MetLife, as I understand that. And, he wasn't doing well. Like, it was kind of coming to the point where, like, that Monday, grandpa was going to let dad go. And, like, he's sitting on the couch on a Saturday morning, and he looks at the TV and wrestling comes on. And he goes, I can do that. And my grandfather goes, I'll make a call. And because that was just, my grandfather kind of just was like that. And so that Monday, my grandfather made a call. He quit MetLife before he got fired, and went and met with Hiro Matsuda, and I can't remember who else was there. Was it Eddie Graham? I can't remember. But he went in and they said to do Hindu squats, and the way my dad had done them. I mean, if you want to know how he could do the pile driver, he did. His legs were like tanks. Mm-hmm. And so he would do jumping Hindu squats, and I've heard so many numbers, but it's like, nobody I know's coined this, so I'm going to coin it. I will ask you, I'm like, is that true, or is that wrestling true? Because those are two different things, right? Mm-hmm. But I have heard he did over 2,000 without stopping.
Wow. Wow.
And from more than one source, from
Right.
people that would have been like, yo, here's the deal. The problem is I wasn't there. I can't corroborate it. That's what I've been told.
So you mentioned the power plant. I want to go back to that. Uh, did your father have a favorite person that he trained that he spoke about, or did he just love them all because he was really enjoy doing that part?
It was all of them. It wasn't one person in particular. He was close with Chuck Palumbo, right? Um, if you look at it this way, people have a very respectful and a very respectful and honorable way of remembering my dad. I'm not saying he was perfect because he was not. But if you look at and talk to the guys that most people are very, they're honorable, they're well respected, throughout the business from the beginning to the end. My dad's one of them. Like, giving back, helping the guys out, never hurt anybody with a finish. Like, put them over. Did those guys make mistakes? Yeah, and I know for a fact Dad pulled them aside. He didn't yell at them. He's like, "Look, you gotta figure this out, right?" So when I hear the stories from the veterans, I saw it. I didn't understand it at the time, but there was a reverence from those guys. Like, they really, really looked up to him. The thing is there's guys today that you would never think would look up to my dad, but they did, because dad would help them and give them angles. And I even talked to somebody recently, as late as like 2018, my dad had gone to the one, up in, I think it was Canada. But like, dad came in and was doing a little bit of wrestling, kind of being part of the show, having some fun. And anyway, like afterwards, Dad's like, "Hey, why did you chop him?" And the guy's like, "What?" He's like, "Why did you throw a chop? After that, why'd you throw a chop?" He's like, "I don't know." He's like, "You should always know why you do something." He's like, if you were in a fist fight and you were brawling, would you throw a chop? He goes, "No." He said, "Then why did you do it then?" And like, that was 7 years ago,
Right.
3 years before he passed. Dad just had that, I want to give it away.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give it away. I want to give you what I got. So he might on one side say, "Oh, the wrestling is done, da, 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 da." And he's not wrong, because everything changes. There's a season for everything. And you know what? The guys today, they're not horrible. It's just different. It's just different,
Right.
My parents hated my music. Well, I always liked theirs, but they hated most of my, rap music and stuff like that. Generations keep moving, and the kids today that are seeing Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes and LA Knight and the Usos, and like, they're gonna be like, "Those are the best wrestlers ever. They're on my Mount Rushmore." And
Right.
nobody's going to look at Bruno Sammartino or Hulk Hogan or the Iron Sheik. And even then, you have the nostalgia of the moment. You liked that when you were a kid. That emotional response is so embedded in you. It's defined you.
Yep.
You chase that feeling every time you watch a match. And it doesn't do what it used to because you're desensitized to it.
Yep.
But I went to a match recently at Raw, and you can see how the TV has changed. Like, I'm of the notion, I liked when Dad would walk down the aisle with no lights, no name, no music, and he would just walk out, and he would walk as slow as possible. And like, I remember he would go like to shoot people away so he'd get in the ring, or he'd wipe his sweat off. Like, right. There was these little things that they don't do that anymore. I don't know if they work anymore, but that's what I enjoyed. Like, right. Those are the things I loved about when he was that arrogant Mr. Wonderful type person. But I went to the event. I'm wearing my dad's robe because I was going to have something going behind me. I was like, I'm going to pull this out. Like, I don't think anybody's going to care. Like, I don't think anybody knows. But I was like, I'm going to wear his robe. This will be fun. And so I invited some friends, and we went to the Raw match. And I'm walking around, and people would be like, "Oh man," they would say things. They're like, "Paul Orndorff." At no point did I like, that's me. That's, I just kept walking around. People would I was like, I just kind of waved. And, a couple people walk up and they'd be like, hey, where did you get that rope? And I'm like, oh, I inherited it. They're like, no way. Wait a second. I follow you on Twitter. Like it was this, and they were like, you're Paul Orndorff's son. I was like, yeah. So I didn't go around like with a sign saying who I was. I just walked around with it on and was like, you know what? I'm just going to bring it back to where it used to go and where it rightfully belongs in many ways. So, but I went and sat down. These kids were like, that is such a cool robe. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, they don't have robes anymore like they used to, right? Miss Libby is not doing this anymore. And so I'm sitting there. There's these two kids behind me, two younger kids. And a couple things I noticed. One is, man, there were a ton of women there. And I was like, and somebody the other day said, wrestling's not what it used to be. I was like, women's wrestling's way better, in my opinion. Like from what I've seen, that product is top notch.
Yep.
They got some good angles on them. Those girls are talented. They're not tight. They got good bodies. Like they got that look. They, that's no offense to anybody in the old days. That's greatly improved. They're not just dragging people around by their hair half a match, right? But I see that one, I'm looking around and it's like, oh, there's a ton of young girls here, right? Like how cool is that? The demographics, I remember what it looked like growing up, and it wasn't young women at all. It was a woman there that was forced there by her husband. And there was the few at the front, like the grandmothers were absolutely packed out and they were angry and mean. And, all of my dad's scars came from a grandmother who hit him over the head with a bottle or something. And I'm not even joking. In Louisiana, your backyard. So when, I'm sitting there and I'm like, wow. And then I'm noticing, I'm like, every demographic, every nationality, every religion is in this crowd. Like it's like, there's people, that are Islamic, right? Like I'm going, I never saw that, right? It was a generally young male, older male with the 70s mustache. Like it was that standard look, right? There were people from all over in that room. And I was like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And to take that in, I went to this dinner and I'm sitting there and the guy that is speaking, I don't know he's the speaker, but I'm sitting there and he's Nigerian. He's got on, I can't remember the names anymore, but he's got on his full, Nigerian clothes. And we're sitting there talking about stuff. He looks over at my nameplate and he's like, Orndorff. And I'm thinking to myself, he has no clue. He just wants to know how to pronounce it, right? And he's like, Paul Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful. You're Mr. Wonderful. He flips out, like goes crazy. And he's like, I got to take a picture with you. My kids are going to freak out. We have the VHS tapes. Like he's going through this whole thing. And I'm like, this guy is genuinely living as a missionary in Nigeria. And he knows who my dad is. And I'm like, at that moment, I went, this is really worldwide wrestling entertainment. It's not a national thing. It covers the world and it does not discriminate at all. And it was to me, to know that I know where it started and that I see people having these moments of joy. I've said this and I mean it. I've been around wrestling fans and I've seen moments where I went, I've never been that happy about anything. And part of me is envious because I'm like, I never got to experience that. Y'all love wrestling. To me, it's just a structure. But for these folks, it's an adrenaline. It's an endorphin. It's a passion that, man, there are people that literally go crazy over it. And I'm not saying that's healthy, but I think somewhere in between, when I hear people say, I love wrestling, I think to myself what my dad would say, which he'd be like, and I love you.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think about it, and we've been on for hour 10 minutes. You okay if we go for another 10 minutes? I have a couple more questions for you.
Dude, I came out of the womb with a full vocabulary.
So, you talk about how, wrestling and how it's changed for women. Look, people don't give professional wrestling enough credit when it comes to bringing people together and the things that they have done to even make places like Saudi Arabia more progressive. When they first started going to Saudi Arabia, women weren't allowed to even be wrestling. Now look what's happening. They actually are okay with these women wrestling. That's huge for an area like Saudi Arabia. I've always said that, especially in today's world where everything is so tense and people are so divided, if you can figure out how to get everyone into professional wrestling, that's what's going to bring people together because professional wrestling brings people together. You don't care what political party someone belongs to when you're sitting next to that man or
Well,
woman.
there was a few people that disagree with that when Hogan came out a couple weeks ago, but but as a general
But,
rule, yes.
but you know what? The whole good thing, I don't think he was booed because of the political stuff. I honestly believe that he was booed because of what came out between him and the Undertaker. I really do. I honestly got do because there's such a love for the Undertaker, and when they found out, according to the Undertaker, that the Undertaker that Hulk Hogan tried to bury the Undertaker in his earlier years, I honestly think that that's why he got booed. But but for the most part, wrestling, people do. You go to the events and you don't care about political parties. All you care about is being able to see your favorite professional wrestler. So to your point, I absolutely agree. But back to your dad, um, as so I know I read that your father always preferred being a heel because he didn't think that there was any money being a baby face. So as a heel, as if that's true, as a heel, with the crowd chanting Paula at them, did that even bother him, like even a little bit mentally? Just because, I mean, I can't imagine almost every night going to a stadium and it's one thing to be booed, but to be called Paula.
So I let me reframe it for you if I
Okay.
can. And I've said this a lot. The way that the world has changed over the last 50 years, and I mean the world, not just wrestling, there is no place for people that their entire identity is built around being hated. It's always 50-50 now, right? So there's the people that love the heels. There's the people that love the baby faces. You can see it in our politics. My dad always said politics are like wrestling. They go, it was different back then. The good guy comes from this side, the bad guy comes from this side. Then they go to the back and they drive together to the next town, right? And they travel together because that's the deal, Unless there was visibility, then they would avoid it because of, kayfabe. But Dad being a heel, this is just my opinion. Dad had some insecurities. Like if you watch he always credited Piper and Heenan for helping him learn how to be in front of a mic. Because he had to be careful what would come out too. Because if he really got going, it probably wouldn't have been okay. Because of USA and all the other channels they were on. But being a heel for him, I think I've always said it allowed him to exercise the demons.
Mm.
It allowed him to unleash this. He had a rough childhood. He had some things happen. And so when you're a baby face and you have insecurities, it's harder to accept the good.
Mm.
And it's easier to accept the negative because you already believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's me psychoanalyzing the situation. But if you don't have and think that highly of who you are, maybe your body and different things, but deep down, you got those emotional wounds that we all have. I don't care which wrestler you talk about. If they didn't have them, they wouldn't be drinking and they wouldn't be wrestling. That kind of comes with the territory back then. But when you look at my father, I think he believed the booze way more than he believed the love. Now, that changed later in life. Like when he got older, He loved, like, he would get more excited than you if you met him. When you started telling him stories about it, like, he would just light up like a Christmas tree. And so I think, again, this is based on my experience with him my entire life and the work I did on myself. And I'm not a counselor. I'm just crazy. So I know my own. But I believe that if your job was to be hated by every single person, and yet they knew not to mess with you, there was this balance. No, being called Paula never. I remember being in the car, and I believe it when he said it. I said, Dad, do you like being a heel? And he's like, have you ever heard 70,000 people hate you? And it's because you're doing your job? That doesn't exist anymore. Right. If you look at some of the polarizing people right now, like we'll just use Elon Musk, it's a 50-50, right? But in wrestling, it was 99-1, right? So when you heard those Paula chants, and when Dad used to tell the stories of darts getting thrown in the ring like it was a normal thing that people go through. And I'm like, Dad, that is insane. But that's all they knew. So walking out and having, like, there was an adrenaline rush that came with having to get out of the town really quick. But I think, and everybody's different. I think for him, the booze just made him more energetic. It made him more intense. He wanted to more. I believe that because I saw him do it to my mom too. So, like he pushed it. He would always push it. But being a heel was easier for him, I think, just as a personality. He didn't have to filter everything. He wasn't a politician. Hogan's a smart guy, whether you like him or not. He's not an idiot, right? So I think for Dad, going out to the ring and just going balls to the wall without any regard and doing any move at any time, you really, you get to unleash everything in the back. Everything's off there. There's nothing off limits at that point. And so the other guys got to take it and so forth and so on. But Dad absolutely adored his fans. But I genuinely believe, like, when he was a heel, 90s got a little cartoonish for me. I didn't like the mirror and that crap, but I know other people do, but that age group and different things. But the fact of the matter is, when Dad would come out and later in life, when he would go out, people were like, man, I hated you so. Like, you can see it pains them to say it because they love my dad now. Like, right. I hated you so much. Thank you. That's what it, like, you get that. I hated you, and you're the nicest guy, right? Like, and you can see in them that they realized he got him. He got him. And anger's the easiest emotion we have. Love, anger's selfish. It's prideful. It's egotistical. Love requires sacrifice. It's selfless. It thinks about the other person, right? And so to have that level of admiration, I hated you so much because you had the body, you had the hair, you had the look, you had the workout in the gym, you had this, intensity, and I wanted you to get beat. Like, that's the best compliment a wrestler could ever get.
Right.
In fact, I had somebody send a message on X and said, I hated your dad as a kid. And I responded, best compliment of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. He was doing his job. Two more questions. First one is, do you have any type of relationship with WWE today?
I do, as a matter of fact. So I don't have the full details because, my mom didn't, she wasn't very open about some of these things. But so when Dad died, and based on the situation, I made sure that it was clear that I would be the executor of his estate. I sat down with my mom and said, tell me everything that's been coming in and going on. And, there was stories that she would tell about different things. And so I kind of thought there was some type of relationship there, right? I took it over and there was nothing. There was no toy deal. There was no t-shirt deal. There was nothing. it non-existent. And to be honest with you, Dad always wanted me to do those things. And I was like, Dad, I'm so busy. Like I'm into, I got a job, I got 2 kids, and so, and I wasn't ready to share myself with the world because this is a vulnerable space to be in. I don't care about criticism. It really doesn't bother me. I believe I have a purpose, and I believe God gave me a platform. And if that platform is because of my dad, well, I used that name for 20, 40 years before for the wrong reason. I'm going to use it for the right reason today. Right. But there was no relationship with anyone. There was no agreements. There was no contracts. So I got my attorney, he's a wonderful man. His name's Bob Rubenthal. He's my keyboard teacher in high school, in 9th grade, and he never fails to tell the story that when I first came in his class, again, severely ADHD, I couldn't sit down. He's like, that you were my least favorite student. Like I couldn't stand you, and by the end of the semester, you were my favorite one. And I was like, well, I switched from heel to babyface. But there was nothing, right? And so I called the people I knew at WWE, and they were responding. Some of the people internally, and they're like, hey, there's nothing here, and that you have no agreement, and we don't really want to do anything. And I was like, oh, well, okay. And so when we started these social media pages, started with Instagram, then Facebook, then X, and now TikTok, and we have a huge following on YouTube, tons of views, all of his matches, a couple of podcasts that I've done are there, and so honestly, the entire mission in my mind was to get you to see my father through my eyes, but I wanted to see him through yours as well. I wanted to connect those dots. And it was part of my grieving, was to honor and celebrate him because he was my daddy that happened to wrestle, but I also had no clue the following he had or the impact he made. Like hearing these stories about pulling kids aside and giving them positive feedback and helping them grow and make good decisions, like that gave my entire life purpose. He wasn't gone for money. That was part of what he did, but he was out changing the world. There are stories I get from people like Travis. When I was a kid, I would get the green marker and draw them down my arm so I look like your dad's veins. Like that is invaluable. And to know my dad brought that level of joy to you, that it gave you me. And these guys are jacked now. And they're like, it's because your dad. I wanted to be like him. And so nothing was there. And I just kind of went, okay, well, I'm fine with that. I made a couple calls. We got some t-shirts going on Pro Wrestling Tees and grew that, and they're wonderful. So that was kind of a baseline. And then, like I had to go through the grieving process. I ended up having a spinal fusion on my back, which left some permanent damage. And so there was this process, but I wanted to put good out in the world. God had saved me from a life and a lifestyle that I know I'm a miracle. And ironically, if you look at the Hebrew, as I understand it, wonderful in the Bible, it actually means miracle. And so I needed a miracle to change my life. And again, the greatest last gift my dad gave me wasn't a robe. It was grief. It was grief. That gave me purpose. I don't think it's a coincidence, and I could be wrong, but I'm not a seminarian. I've come to say, like, hey, it doesn't surprise me that Jesus's dad, Joseph, died before his ministry, because when my dad died, I had to be the patriarch. I had to be Mr. Orndorff. I had to step in and make decisions, financial, medical, all these different things. And that was a huge burden when you look at the man and the footsteps you walked in. Move forward. We did start. We have a couple of wrestling figures coming out. We got him in Ultra Pro Wrestling. He's now a downloadable character on the Saturday Night Main Event DLC coming out in November on WWE 2K25. So last year, I'll get emotional, but it's funny. I didn't get his hair, I didn't get his muscles, but I definitely got his emotions. So you know, it would have been his 75th birthday. And so like 3 weeks before that, I woke up and I just typed up something about, you know, it being his 75th birthday. I sent to my producer, Tyler Elenick, shout out to him, my buddy there. He's like, that's great. You know, your dad didn't, you know, his birthday's not for 3 weeks. I was like, oh yeah. Like, but I woke up thinking it was his birthday. Like, I don't know why. So that morning, I didn't have anything to do. Like, I didn't post it or anything. I was volunteering for a nonprofit then, and so I get a text message, and it says, "Hey, this is Ben from WWE. Can we talk later this afternoon?" And I just read what I wrote like a month before, and I'm sitting in front of my computer, and I'm like, I did not just get this text message because I never pursued WWE. I wanted to put good out into the world. I wanted to bring glory and honor to my heavenly father and my earthly father. And I wanted people to know he wasn't perfect, but he loved me. And love can cover a multitude. In fact, it can cover all of us. It can cover all of our sins. It can cover all of our discretions. It can cover all of it. Love conquers all. And so I'm sitting there and I text Tyler, the producer. I was like, dude, I think we just got a call from the major leagues. He's like, what? And because that was always his dream. Never mind. I just was like, I'm good either way. Talked to him that afternoon, and Ben says, hey, we love seeing what you do, and we want to be part of it. And I'm like, I can't even speak. Completely choked up. Because you just want to honor your daddy. If people could do what I've done to honor their parent, they would. Like it, you know, I have a platform. I'm not unaware. He did all the hard work, right? He built the legacy. I just had to show up, and I had to show up with all of me. So I'm sitting there, and Ben's like, are you there? I was like, dude, I can't catch my breath. Give me a second. And I was like, I would have done it for free. I just want to honor my dad. And he's like, and that's why we want to work with you. And I go, Ben, question for you. He's, yeah. I said, did you know it was my dad's 75th birthday? He said, oh, no way. That's kind of cool. I was like, yeah, it's kind of cool. And I've said that in that moment, it was like, you know, God and my dad just kind of winked, you know, said, hey, we see what you're doing. And it wasn't a reward. It was more of, here is a way that the world can continue to see the things that God has done for me, good and bad, through this life, through the history, through the WWE and the interactions and the family and all the things that, you know, people are like, you're royalty. I'm like, dude, I wear flip-flops year round. I am Florida trash. You know, like, I don't like wearing shirts. I am by far not royalty. But you know, in that world, you know, there's a space for me to share the love that my father gave. And so to see the WWE come in and go, we like what you're doing, it really just resonates that my heart is to entertain and to love and to appreciate and respect the new and the old, because they all work together. If my dad was in a WrestleMania, would it do what it's done today? Gosh, you know, the thing is, we'll never ever know. So there's no reason to ask the question. Right. The fact of the matter is, he was. And, you know, my father was part of the legacy of Hulk Hogan, you know, and you know, my dad wasn't perfect. He said and did some things that weren't great, but he taught me to do it different. And so, by the grace of God, I'll continue to do what I do.
Well, speaking of honoring your father, and this is the last question, walk me through the day he found out that he was going to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. How much did that mean to him, and how excited was he the day of?
So so my dad had gotten injured while he was with Turner, so he was on long-term disability till he turned 67. It wasn't like he could go back to work, and that was a tumultuous period. And my dad's life was a couple of those years around 2005. I had graduated, and was out of the house, and so he had a very much a love-hate with wrestling. And I saw a multitude of emotions. I saw a level of happiness that he was, being added to it. There was also a level of arrogance that he wasn't thought of the way he thought he should be, and there was some evidence during that period that a lot of the things that they did for royalties, they had kind of cut back on, bringing my dad up. If you go back and look at the retro figures in the wrestling ring they brought back with retro, like they didn't use my dad because he wasn't signed. They used Big John Studd, and so it was a mixed emotion. I wasn't there the day he got inducted. I got the phone call, and Dad would never really show you all his cards, right? So he was kind of like, like, okay, cool. I think he felt that he had and true or not true, I think he felt like he didn't get taken care of. At the same time, I think he made some poor decisions, the way he left WWF, so forth and so on. So I know they brought us into town to help out Chris Masters. Dad was kind of mentoring him there, and they gave Dad some money to do that and some stuff. And I think there was a level of there was a thought that maybe he could come back and guide these guys, kind of help train, because he did have a great reputation around that. But when we went out there, it wasn't. When we went to Vegas, Cauliflower Cup, when he got a award there, or, the different places, Dad, it's as hot and as cold as he could be. It wasn't indifference. It was more of like, this is in my past. And so there was a period of time when we're in the back and Stallone's there and Hogan's there. And when Dad doesn't shake Hogan's hand during that, Dad wasn't necessarily mad at Hogan. He was mad that they centered the whole thing around him, including the TV show, because they only filmed a certain portion of that or aired a certain portion of that. And Dad didn't understand that. That kind of made him mad because it was a showboat type thing. And look, Hulk Hogan was the marquee. It is what it is. But Dad wasn't thrilled about that. So when he didn't stand up and shake his hand, he was a little irritated. And in fact, I was sitting behind Linda Hogan. God bless her. I was sitting behind her, and I stood up. I didn't realize this, but I didn't clap either. And I just sit there with a smug face. I'm wearing a pink dress shirt, and I was just sitting there like I was like, wow, I'm an a-hole. But I think he was very proud of the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, and over time, he found more gratitude in it. Not necessarily, this is 2005, so 5 years after surgery, and he's at a point in his life where he physically can't do what he used to do. So there was a lot of emotion that went into those things, because he was going into a world he can no longer be a part of because he physically can't do it. So it's like you just teased him a little bit. Right. You just teased him with the opportunity because he loved doing what he did. He loved wrestling, loved it, but he knew he couldn't do it. Now, my dad couldn't have expressed that in words that, well, Trav, I can't do what I used to do. But he did later. Like, we had these conversations. So when we went out there and we did that, he loved seeing the boys. Like, remember me, and this is before everything came out, but Pat Patterson came and sat next to me, and my dad's like, and I was like, what? He's like, and later on, he's like, let me just tell you what goes on here. I was like, oh, yeah, because I was like 24 at the time. But I think more than anything, when that happened, it kind of hurt his heart, because he could go out and do wear a tux and go up on stage, but he could never get back in a ring.
Right.
And that was what brought him success. That's what helped prepare a lot of things that, were traumatic in his life. It gave his life purpose. And as somebody who has a disability physically, that is, man, when you can't, like, I can't hit the gym like I used to. And I loved the gym. There's mornings when I wake up, I'm in so much pain. I'm like, man, what am I remember true story. So I had gone through this journey of sobriety, but there was this period of time where I was really struggling with, I can't go do what I used to do. Like, running's not an option, and so getting and wrapping your head around that in your late 40s, early 50s, when you see your, Ricky Steamboat, Arn, and a lot of these guys are still working and helping out these guys, like, he felt cut off from that world, and not because anybody cut him off, but because he couldn't do what
Right.
genuinely had given him an identity from, he was an athlete. I'm pretty sure he sprinted or broad jumped out of the womb. Like, he was an athlete built different, according to the words of Lee Haney, Mr. Olympia. So it was very much a mixed bag. And I was surprised. I think there was the story of my dad leaving the plaque behind, which he did. And I put it in my bag. So Sarah was like, oh, I guess that wasn't true. I was like, no, he really did. He threw it in the trash can. Like, I grabbed it. Oh, yeah. But I'll tell you why I think that happened. It wasn't because it was WWE. It was because everything kind of was built around Hogan. And my dad tried to interact with Vince, and Vince kind of, I was back there, and I remember he said to Vince, he's like, I'm not always hard to deal with. And Vince didn't really say anything. And I think that hurt him. I think it hurt him. And I remember saying to Dad, why don't you, this is before that, Dad, why don't you go back to WWF? And he said, I can't. And I was like, can't or won't? Like, is this an ego thing? And he goes, Vince told me when I was there, don't screw me and you'll have a job the rest of your life. And he said, and I screwed him and I didn't show up. And so I can't go back. And so a lot of things emotional go into your everybody thinks the Hall of Fame, that also means retirement, permanent, right? You're not going to the glory days again. And a lot of people got a lot of adrenaline and a lot of purpose and a lot of positive feedback for that lifestyle. And you can never walk out to it ever again. And that's painful and that's hard. And so taking that next step, like my dad, Steve, told Steve, there's life after wrestling. My dad did find life after wrestling. It just took a minute, and that was very much at the beginning of that journey.
Well, Travis, tell you what, I am so thankful that you came here, not just because of who your father was, but because you also have an incredible story. You have a story of being able to pick yourself back up, move on, uh, and as well as be able to touch people's lives in a positive way. I thank you for also continuing and sharing the legacy of your father within professional wrestling. He was so much more than professional wrestling. But a lot of us grew up watching him, and he brought a lot of joy to our lives as well. Which was a sacrifice for your life, really. You in a sense you had to share your father. So I
It
I,
worked
I
out okay.
I thank you for all of that. You're always welcome on this podcast. I really enjoy talking to you. I think that we barely even scraped the top of the career of your father, to be honest with you. I wanted to talk about you as well, though. So, is there anything? 'Cause I know you're a motivational speaker. Is there anything you want to plug?
So I have been recently spending time consulting with some different nonprofits, as I had volunteered for one last year. A couple opportunities to speak have come forward. And I tell people I've talked all my life, but now I actually have something to say. And so and it's my journey. It's my journey through figuring out how to I didn't put the pieces back together. God did that for me, but I showed up and I was willing. And so you know, of my story, whether it be of recovery, or of growing up in wrestling, you know, those things absolutely you defined multiple people, not just me. And so, you know, I've had the opportunity to mentor some of the wrestlers' kids because I'm kind of the older guy in the crowd now, right? And so, yeah, I've spoken recently. Some opportunities are coming up. You know, I still consider myself a servant at heart. And so, whatever that looks like, I do privately consult with people that are struggling with substance abuse or family members that are dealing with that. And I just help get them on the right path. And so, yeah, I think I've got 2 events coming up, but, you know, until I get the go ahead, I won't share those. But a couple of them will be on TV, I think. And, you know, you know, my story is one that is shaped by a decision to believe in that Jesus Christ died on the cross. A decision that I had to find out how to do life a different way, and I had a father that encouraged and loved me, and so I was able to accept the grace and forgiveness because I knew that I was worth it. And so, if that resonates with people, if it, you know, helps an individual from, you know, consider like mental health and substance abuse, you know, over 110,000 people die every year from fentanyl overdose. Like things have changed, and with the level of anxiety and pain in this world, you know, there's a way to do life and do life in a way that is fun, that there's peace, there's joy, there's comfort. And so whatever door God opens up, I'm willing to walk through. And if that means talking, then I always joke that I was like, you know, some people are God's hands and feet, and I'm his mouth. But you know, you know, my story is just one of honestly of saying, here's what I suggest based on what has worked for me after having experienced these things: the emotional trauma, sexual trauma, you know, substance abuse, failed relationships. And yeah, so you know, follow us at Paul Orndorff, you know, Paul Orndorff WWE. We're on YouTube, X, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. But you know, I'm out there. I just do what I think the right thing to do is next. And I try to piece those little wins together. And so you know, I'm grateful you let me come on, and any chance I have to encourage or share or just remind people, like, this life is hard, and right now it may be one of the most difficult periods. Ironically, we have the most comforting situation we've ever had, and yet we're in the most pain. And you know, if I can shed a light and be a witness to somebody to take that next step or make that phone call, or, you know, learn how to, you know, ask for help, that's a hard thing to do. So that's what I'm here for. And if that, whatever that looks like, I'm willing to be there. So I appreciate again, Kevin, you let me on. And you know, please don't marry any more of your nephews.
Man, when you called that, I was like, God, he's so right about that. But again, thank you for coming on. Hey, everybody, coming Monday, Mr. Herb Simmons and the new Hall of Famer, Bob Cook, will be on, and they're going to be telling stories about their wrestling career and all the things that they've been a part of, the things they've witnessed, maybe some ribs. So you guys make sure to check that out. It will be live only on YouTube. So please subscribe to my channel. Again, Travis, thank you so very much, my man. I think this is probably one of my favorite interviews. I really enjoy talking to you, listening to your story. You all have a great weekend.